Hello and welcome to this month's session on parenting with the brain in mind. Specifically, this month, we are going to be focusing on a topic that I think is really, really important and valuable as parents to really be considering. And honestly, this is one of those kind of arenas where I've just heard a lot of concern around this. I've heard a lot of families really kind of struggling with the relationship that they feel between themselves and their children's school. And so really what we're focusing on today is how do we bridge the gap between school and home? How do we really kind of address and come to a place where we're able to kind of work at and be on the same team with our children's school rather than feeling like there's any toxicity to the relationship or rather than feeling like we're kind of combative with the school that we're trying to work against. And so often when I've talked with families, what we find is that there's kind of this negative feeling behind the relationship, or at least maybe I should more specifically say, for the families that might have a child that might struggle a little bit with school, whether it's the academics, whether it's their behaviors, whether there's things socially going on with other students, that there's often kind of this distance that exists there and they get really frustrated by it and they're not quite sure what to do about it. And it ends up feeling like they're in kind of constant argument with school rather than being able to collaborate and work with the school. And so we really want to work with you today around just some basic ideas and principles around how we can, begin to foster positive connections with school. So there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot that goes into kind of this gap, if you will. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I think that the majority of the most common issues that I've heard of between kind of the family to school relationship kind of falls into these three categories. One is that there is a overarching perception of opposing viewpoints. The second is that there's communication is often being limited to times of crisis. And the third is that overall, there's a non-collaborative approach being taken. And so once again, there's a lot more than that, but these are the areas where we're really going to try to spend a lot of our time focusing today's presentation on. Now, first and foremost, what I think is always so important for us is that we're bringing everything back to this basic understanding of the brain. We spent a lot of time talking about the brain in some of our previous sessions. What I think is most important as we're thinking about the brain up front here, as it relates to, quite frankly, the relationship between ourselves and the schools where the children within our care are attending, is really making sure that we are remembering and recognizing that our brains are very relational at their core. Our brains want to be in relationship and in connection with others. We are literally born with this neurobiological need to be in relationship with others. We are a species that is 100% reliant on relationships to be able to be successful. And so that is a beautiful element to who we are as human beings. And most people will talk about the favorite part of their job or their family or their community being the relationships that they have. We value that, and relationships have an unbelievable power and amazing thing for us. But relationships, or the lack thereof, can also be the source of a lot of struggle. They can also be the source of a lot of frustration. What's interesting about our brains, because they're relational in our core, our brains understand that not all people are safe, that not all people are going to be positive. And so our brains are very good at beginning to categorize almost all stress and all things that we experience as being positive or negative. Our brains will take in different experiences and tell us, okay, that is a thing, a place, or a person I can trust. That is one that I can't trust. Or we can begin to kind of learn, how do I interact with this person versus that person? Some people call that, it's kind of been popularized as code switching, where we realize that around different people, we might behave differently. So for instance, to my students, I would always explain to them, yeah, I talk a little bit differently at work than I do at home to my children, than I might if I'm just hanging out with some friends, than I might if I'm at Christmas dinner with my family. Each one of those environments, I'm going to kind of at times talk a little bit differently. Maybe I'll choose different words. Maybe I'll speak in a more relaxed way. Maybe I'll joke more or less in different environments, but you kind of are altering who you are in some different relationships to be able to kind of switch to what's going to be acceptable there and what's going to give you predictable outcomes. And our brains love predictable outcomes. Our brains know what to expect in different situations, and therefore they are learning what's happening, and then we create predictable outcomes based on that. And that often serves us well in life because it often helps us to a place of self-preservation. And so, you can think of some of like the most kind of like obvious challenging relational experiences. So kind of the classic, though it's a stereotype, would be, you go to the DMV, you're going to find some people there that are not necessarily loving their day-to-day work, and they might be grumpy and short with you. And so you kind of go into that not expecting to have a relationally fulfilling moment. You go into that and maybe your guard's up a little bit more. Maybe you choose to be a little bit less friendly because you don't think they're going to be, or conversely, you choose to be way more friendly to try to compensate for what you're walking into. So you're entering into this relational experience, because anytime two humans are interacting, there's a relational experience. You're entering into that with some preconceived notions as to how that experience is going to go. And then you're adopting your kind of manner of which you're handling that in a way to create a more predictable outcome. So if you are convinced that it needs to be positive, you're going to be way more friendly and positive to make it impossible to be mean to you. If you're convinced that it's going to be negative and you're okay with that, you just know that you can't put yourself out there too much. And so you're going to kind of address it a little bit more shortly as well. And so in simple relationships like that, that's essentially how we enter into it. So the same thing occurs when you are considering your relationships that you have with a school and with the personnel from a school that may be reaching out to you. If you have had a history where some of those communications have been negative, where you have had kind of people that called and it felt like they were yelling at you, felt like they were putting you down, it felt very, very negative, then you know that when you go into that next call with school, when you see the school show up on your caller ID, when you know that you have a appointment and you need to go in and have a meeting, your brain is already saying, "Ooh, I know what to expect out of school personnel." And so all of a sudden, you're beginning to put those guards up. You're not doing this cognitively. You're not necessarily, sometimes you are, but our brain begins to do that in a manner that is just self-protective, where there might not be as much cognitive thought there, but our brain is saying, okay, we need to be on guard when we're going here. Now, once again, this is a normal neurobiological response to stress and relationships. And what's good about that is that the way you can change those things as an adult, it's a lot harder as a child. As an adult, if you have a nice, fully developed cortex, is that you can use your cortex to actually have some control over the lower regions of your brain. And so simply labeling some of those things as you walk into it, it doesn't completely wipe out everything that's there, but it brings up to your consciousness the fact that you've had negative experiences in the past, and it helps you to be more open to the possibility that this next experience might not be as negative. And so it helps you to kind of go into it that way. If you don't go into it that way, chances are you are really looking for what you call confirmation bias. You're going to twist words and nonverbals to say, yep, I could tell that person was annoyed, or I could tell that person hates me or hates my child. You can really begin to kind of form the belief system that you have there. And so really, I think step one in all of this is, unfortunately, there are times and places where you are going to have negative conversations with a school, where the teacher or counselor or administrator or whomever is reaching out probably doesn't handle it great. And we want to just be mindful that we don't say that that one negative experience that maybe I had in elementary school needs to directly impact every other experience I have with school for the rest of my child's educational career. Instead, we want to be able to, once again, cognitively begin to accept, okay, that happened, and that is 100% true, but that doesn't mean the next conversation with that person or with similar people needs to be that negative. So once again, trying to prepare ourselves for that and understand what our brain's default is and the way that we turn that off is really bringing to the service, cognitively preparing ourselves for the potential that the next interaction would be able to go a little bit differently. So now to jump into kind of those three areas that I spoke about before. The first is that there's this perception of opposing viewpoints. And so oftentimes what happens when we need to reach out to school with a concern, or the school is reaching out to us as the parents with some type of concern, there is this perception, and I say perception, I'll kind of dig into that a little bit more shortly, but there is this perception that we are kind of on opposite sides of a situation here, where we kind of disagree with what's really at the core of what's happening. And so we find ourselves in some type of argument. Often what's kind of, preceding to this is that we begin when either we're getting the call or giving the call, feeling under attack. Oftentimes as a parent, we have the perception that somebody's saying to us, well, this is happening because you're a bad parent. And conversely, as a teacher, as the parent is then, kind of replying back, they get to this place where like, oh, are you saying I'm a bad teacher? I can't handle my classroom. I can't handle my job. Both of those things are very, very personal and emotional things that nobody wants to feel attacked on. Nobody wants to be told that you can't do what you can't parent well, or you can't do your job well. Those things feel terrible. Now, here's the reality. Once again, there's times that somebody might actually be saying those things, but more often than not, they're not actually saying that. That's how you're perceiving it. And in a time of high stress, remember, you move through your brain. So maybe you were in your cortex and you picked up the phone and they are telling you this, issue with your child. And all of a sudden, you begin to move down. It's stressful to find out that things aren't going well. You move into the limbic level of your brain. In the limbic level of your brain is the social emotional part of your brain. That's why it's very, very normal that you're immediately going to jump to like, oh my goodness, I'm so terrible. I can't do this. And now it feels like, okay, this self-doubt that I have is being brought to me by this teacher. And so whether you're in your limbic or going even lower now, suddenly you're becoming a little bit more reactive, which is completely normal. You're not putting as much time and thought between your feelings and your reactions, which means you're probably not constructing your rebuttals or replies nearly as well as you would want to. And you begin saying things that, even if you're not explicitly saying it, makes the teacher feel like, oh, I'm not very good at my job. Like, you think I can't handle your kid. And now all of a sudden we are both now lower in our brain. And then when you have two dysregulated people conversing back and forth, it's not going to get very constructive. And what I've so often seen happen is I've talked to so many school personnel and so many parents that say that what I just described there. It feels like I'm under attack. It feels like they are criticizing me. And then when you get lower in your brain and you're dysregulated, all of a sudden you start gravitating towards a polarized viewpoint, meaning that the gap between the family and the school begins to get wider and wider. And you end up having these arguments about things that weren't related to the call in the first place. So suddenly you're arguing about some school policy that might be lightly but not very directly involved with the situation. Or maybe you're fighting about the new school schedule or something that happened at a board meeting, whatever the case might be. Suddenly you find this kind of topic that somehow arose because you were lower in your brain, just being reactive. And now you are like grabbing on to your opposite sides of that topic very, very tightly. And all of a sudden you find yourself in like frustrated debate with each other, even though you don't actually care about this thing that you're arguing about, or it has nothing to do with the actual reason you're having that conversation. And so suddenly you are just finding yourselves unnecessarily in combat once again. And what I think is so important that we're realizing here is that even though there is this perception of opposing viewpoints, even though there is this feeling that you are in argument with one another, that you're frustrated with one another, etc., what is so important to understand is that at the end of the day, you probably do both have this central goal together. Because here's the reality. As a parent, if you are a parent watching this video, I would imagine you fall into the category that 99.999% of parents do, which is that you care about your kids and you want what's absolutely best for them. I get that there's exceptions and that there's folks that have very different viewpoints or that support differently or don't support their children. But the vast majority, once again, if you're willing to listen to me talk for 45 minutes or so, then I believe that you are in that category of people that you care about your kid and you want what's best for them. Now, what I think is important to know is that just as much as I've worked with a lot of parents, I've worked with even more teachers, principals, administrators, counselors in school. I've worked with tens of thousands of school staff in my past. And I have come across very, very few, maybe one, who I really believe, you know what, don't care about the kids. The vast, vast, vast majority of people that choose to work in a school are choosing to do so because they have a heart for young people. Everyone shows it a little bit differently, but they believe that they have strengths and abilities or knowledge that can help to support the lives of young people. They believe that there is a purpose behind their role in that school and that that can really make a very, very positive impact on your child. And so the reason that I share that is, though there might be some minutia that you have opposing viewpoints on, the core between the two of you is that you both want that child to succeed. You might have slightly different approaches to how that is going to happen, but you have way more common ground than you realize. And when we get stuck in these kind of fights and arguments, it's so important that we take the time to reconsider where we're at and say, you know what? We need to stop this. And we need to realize, like, okay, we're both in this for the child. Like, let's find our common ground before we start to really dig into some of the things that are frustrating us and some of the areas where we may differ a little bit here. And so as we can recenter on that, that's going to set everybody up for having a lot more success as we're trying to support a child. The next piece is that oftentimes the primary source of communication between school and home ends up happening during times of crisis or during really, really challenging times and moments. And once again, I think that this creates kind of a few really, really challenging elements. So first off, we often wait till things are really bad. So there's a big issue. And then at school, they say, okay, we're going to call home, like, because this happened. And at times at home, we almost threaten that, well, I'm going to call the school and get to the bottom of this. Like, we utilize it as a threat rather than as a form of collaboration. And so we are kind of utilizing that other place, this other space, as a time of like, all right, like we're gonna do that. And so it makes the communication of the two feel negative to the child. And it has you kind of adding this negative connotation behind it. What also then happens is, I've worked with a lot of parents who are like, every time that phone rings and I see the school's number on it, I suddenly know it's going to be a negative conversation because the school is not calling when things are good. They're not reaching out when things are good. And conversely, oftentimes, if you feel the need to call the school, we're not calling to say, I just want to say you're doing such a great job. I love that homework assignment. We're calling to say, you know, get to the bottom of something that our child is reporting that happened at school. We are calling because of something we're frustrated with. We're calling because we don't like the workload that's coming out. Whatever the case might be, there's usually a loaded conversation. And so you're receiving a call, you already in your limbic part of your brain. You see that number and you're like, okay, every time they call, it's negative. And so all of a sudden your stress level increases, you get lower in your brain, and you begin getting into that cycle we talked about previously that is likely not going to support a positive relationship. Similarly, you call them and they're like, okay, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so is on the phone. And they're like, okay, let me get ready for this. I know this is going to be a tough one. And so one of the big things here is to make sure that we are being really, really intentional about making and taking opportunities to have positive and or relationship building communication with school personnel. Now, what that looks like is kind of twofold. For one, that might look like you being intentional about reaching out to the school when things are going well. And, sending that, not waiting for a holiday, but just sending a quick email or text or whatever other, applications your school might use just to communicate like, hey, I just wanted to say, my child's having such a great time. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say I'm so impressed by how much my child's, reading or math or whatever skills have been developing since they've been in your class. I really am appreciative of that. Thank you so much. Hey, I love that it sounds like my child is not having much behavioral issues, and I know you must be playing a role in that. Thank you so much. So getting those messages so that, for one, they see that you are able to kind of honor what they're doing. It makes them feel good. It makes them not be on high alert just because they see that you emailed or see that you called. And then secondly, what it begins to do there is it helps the teacher to feel validated. Remember, step two is like, okay, I feel like you're telling me I stink at my job. It's giving evidence to say, I don't think that. I'm calling out some things that you've done positive, so that in the future, when you might have to have that challenging conversation, you have a foundation there that says, you know what, we've had positive moments. This has been good. Like, so all of a sudden, once again, I'm not as reactive when we have this conversation. It doesn't mean it's going to be a fun conversation, but at least there's some foundation there to have cause you to have less of an emotional reaction, or for them to have less of an emotional reaction during that conversation. The other thing that you can do is be really intentional and go out of your way to participate in some of the family-oriented events that a school might put on. And so when they have parent nights, coming out to that, when they have opportunities for parents to enter into the classroom. Now, I understand that there might be some very real things that get in the way of that. And you can't always change your work schedule. You can't always change the things that you're required to do at home and et cetera to be able to get there. But when you're able to be present there, because don't always look at it as though it is, well, I don't care about the specific information that they say they want me to come and learn that night. Look at it more as a relationship building opportunity. You get to enter in, even if you don't have a one-on-one conversation with everybody, they are seeing that you're there. They're seeing that investment. They're seeing that you came to that. Because one of the things I've seen from schools a lot is they put a lot of thought and time and energy into hosting these family and community events. And they are often, though not always, but they're often, especially in the secondary level, they have very few people attending them. And so that's discouraging. But when they see somebody there, they're like, oh, I'm so happy so-and-so is there. And so it builds this certain level of excitement. And once again, it helps to foster a positive bond with that adult. And so it's a great way for you to begin to have a good relationship with folks when it's not something negative that's occurring at that point in time. And so also just being intentional about not trying to kind of weaponize school against your children. So not being like, all right, if you keep acting up, I'm going to call your teacher and tell them, X, Y, or Z of what's going on, but making sure that your conversations at home as they relate to school are positive, because not only does that impact your child's perspective of school and school feeling like a punishment, but it actually helps to build your own belief system when you're talking about school in a negative way that make you feel like, okay, school is bad, school is negative. And so we don't want to kind of build that up in our own brains to make school feel big and bad to our children or to ourselves. And then once again, we're understanding just when we do all of that, that's just having a direct impact on emotionally where we're at when we're really thinking about school. And so then the third piece of this that we kind of brought up here is this idea that we're often taking a non-collaborative approach. And so when we're thinking about a non-collaborative approach, we're going to be talking for most of the rest of this session on what it means to take a collaborative approach. But it's really about when we're not being collaborative, we're not working with others. It's all, kind of individualistic. And so first and foremost, when we take a non-collaborative approach, we're really quick to talk and really slow to listen. And so when we're taking a non-collaborative approach, whether you're the one initiating the phone call or receiving the phone call, it's usually a little bit of a battle for who's going to talk next. And instead of listening to all that's being communicated, we're quicker to be sitting there thinking about what our next rebuttal is. And so we're thinking more about what we're going to say rather than what that other person is saying. And so we're only catching kind of bits and pieces of it. And so once again, this builds to that polarization between the two. This makes it really challenging to kind of foster the type of relationship that we are hoping to be able to have. And when we do that, when we're not listening, when we're speaking over the other person, we're quick to only utilize our own solutions, and we're hesitant to consider the solutions of the other. And so we're not really listening to or understanding what the solution is that the other person might be recommending. And we're real quick to say, nope, that doesn't work. This is what you need to do. And so we're not really kind of fully aligned with that. And then when that occurs, what often happens is that one of the two parties involved is not convinced that the plan is actually going to be effective. Now, here's the reality of it. As a parent, what I find most parents feel is that the school has the upper hand. Like at the end of the day, they are able to say, you know what, you're suspended or you're not suspended, you're expelled or you're not expelled. Like there's this power differential that exists there. And so what often happens is you're having a kind of challenging moment if there's been some behaviors or some issues going on, and you kind of are hearing these solutions, you're hearing what's happening, you don't necessarily agree with it, but you also feel a little bit powerless. And it basically is kind of delivered by the school in this feeling of kind of my way or the highway. And so at the end of the day, you and or your children need to kind of just be like, all right, well, I'm legally obligated to keep my child in the school right now. And maybe I believe in that and want that as well. So we just have to say, yep, sure, we agree with whatever your plan is right now. But oftentimes, you're not really convinced that the plan is going to be effective. And if you're not convinced the plan is going to be effective, that plan is probably not going to be effective. And so when we take this more non-collaborative approach, it ends up really resulting in plans that are not going to be able to work as well. And so what we really want to work towards is taking a far more collaborative approach as we're trying to figure out the best way to support our relationship with the school, which ultimately, once again, is all about supporting children. And so that leads us to this program. It's called Collaborative Problem Solving, that I want to be really kind of focusing the rest of our time on today, because I really think it's what's at the core between fostering these positive relationships between school and home, and once again with the child. And I think the more that we're collaborating, the more that we find that we're really closing that gap down. One of the things I want to say, and you'll hear me bounce back and forth between this a little bit, that this approach is something that works really well in the adult to adult relationship. It's also something that was initially designed, though, once again, it works both ways, to really foster the adult to child relationship. And so you can utilize this as a practice as you're trying to support your own child through things that are completely unrelated even to school. But for the sake of today's conversation, we're going to be focusing on it a little bit that way, but usually a little bit more school related. And then obviously as an approach that two adults can utilize as they're trying to figure out how to best continue to support their child and how we can best continue to move forward here. So at the core of the collaborative problem-solving approach is this idea of the difference between skill and will. And so there's these two statements that they utilize a lot, and that's that kids do well if they can, or kids do well if they want to. And at a quick kind of cursory glance at those, they feel like they are very, very similar statements. But what you really find is that there's a very specific and unique difference between the two. When we say kids do well if they want to, what that implies is that a child is choosing to do well or choosing not to do well. And I think this is really important because so often when we look at behaviors of concern, a lot of the way that we talk about those and respond to those, and we'll talk about the responses, the popular responses to that here shortly, implies that the child was making a conscious decision to exhibit the specific behaviors of concern that are leading to whatever these issues are that may arise. And so we are operating under the assumption that it is a purposeful, conscious choice. Whereas when we think of the statement, kids do well if they can, then what we're really beginning to recognize is that this might be a little bit more related to skill development. This might also be pretty related to, do they have the right support systems in place to be able to accomplish the things that they're trying to do? Now, if you believe that it's a skill deficit, you're probably, for whatever the behavior or issues or might be, going to offer something on one list of things. And if you believe that it is a will issue, if it is a choice issue, then you're likely going to take a different approach and begin to offer a whole different list of things. And so kind of starting with this idea of, if we think that kids do well if they want to, it really often is that when you see a challenging behavior, and the more challenging the behavior is, the more quick we are to see this and use language that implies this, it leads us to this belief that kids do well if they want to. And so we're quick to use that. Why did you choose to do that? You're trying to be disrespectful. You're refusing to do this. We put a lot of intentionality behind that. And so we are assuming that what they're doing is a choice. And when we believe that, our job becomes, we must make our kids choose better, right? We must make the child want to do well, want to do something different here. And so we then kind of go to a few default motivating techniques. And across the board, the two most popular things for trying to motivate a child are to get them to kind of be driven towards a reward or trying to avoid a certain punishment or consequence. And so there is a time and a place for rewards and consequences. I want to be crystal clear here. I am not trying to say, okay, we want to throw rewards and consequences completely out the door. There's never a time and a place for them. There is indeed a time and a place for them. They do serve some purposes. For somebody who is up in their cortex, for somebody whose brain is at what you would call kind of an age-appropriate spot, they are able to handle what's going on. Rewards and consequences are great for teaching simple lessons of right and wrong. I know when I'm allowed to talk. I know when I'm not allowed to talk. That's right. That's wrong. I know, the basic rules that exist in school. I can get some kind of, external motivation. Okay, if I work extra hard, I can earn this thing. All of that implies that you have cortical modulation, that you have access to your cortex, and you can utilize that to control some of your lower brain impulses that occur. And so that's amazing. And once again, there is a time and a place for that, and they can absolutely work. But that's kind of the limit to what most rewards and consequences are able to do. Rewards and consequences cannot teach complex thinking skills. Remember, it's simplistic, right or wrong, do this, don't do that. It does not teach kind of like the rationale behind why I might do something. It doesn't teach kind of great morals. It teaches just things that are very, very specific. Generally speaking, they do not really help to foster positive relationships. And so when we are just looking at rewards and consequences, that's not something that's going to help to kind of foster a greater connection with our child. It's once again just about kind of being, policing behaviors. It does not help students, rather, to stay regulated. So once again, if a child is in their cortex, they are probably staying self-regulated pretty well, and we don't need them to support them at that moment in time. But for a child who's dealing with stress, or a child who might have some other things going on in life, rewards and consequences not only are not going to just magically get them back up to the cortex, it's not going to help them to become regulated, but in fact, more often than not, those are going to be triggering things that are going to cause the child to move even lower in their brain. And so we're realizing that many times rewards and consequences are actually dysregulating. And then it doesn't teach them how to solve any complex problems. So once again, it polices their behavior, but it doesn't give them problem-solving skills as they're trying to move forward. Now, in terms of believing that kids do well if they want to, there is a time and a place where there is some level of intentional defiance. And so where a child is in their cortex or has access to their cortex, and they're consciously choosing to behave a certain way. But even when that's happening, they're not typically doing that just because they're like, oh, I'm bored. It's what I wanted to do. More often than not, there's still a really powerful reason behind that. And so one of the big ones is seeking some semblance of connection. And so when we're thinking of it that way, sometimes it's that attention of peers is their needed internalized reward. And so they want to be seen and feel seen by their peers. They want to make somebody laugh. They want to make somebody, see them. And so that's something that sometimes they're kind of seeking out. So behaviors, those class clown type of behaviors, is about feeling seen by somebody else, which often means that they're not getting enough of that throughout the course of the day or throughout their life. They're not feeling as seen. And so they are trying to find an environment that's going to help them to be seen a little bit more. And what's interesting is that the brain in this scenario would prefer negative attention over no attention. And so they would rather have negative reinforcement and feel like they're getting yelled at, whatever the case might be, over feeling like they're not seen at all. And so they're seeking some level of attention in that moment. And then another piece that kind of is related to this connection element is if they are feeling disrespected. Once again, if we're looking at this from the school behavior standpoint, if they feel disrespected by that staff. And so what's interesting is that as relational beings, which is a lot of what we've talked about up until now, you walk into school and you feel like a teacher, whether it's all the time or in that moment, did something to disrespect you. Well, we end up reciprocating that. And so when we feel negative about how somebody treated us, we're going to reciprocate that and probably be a little bit disrespectful back towards them. And in school, the way that kids often show some level of disrespect to a staff is by not doing their work, not showing up to their class, and not following their rules. And so even though those things usually impact the child a lot more than they impact the adult, that is their way of showing disrespect. And then conversely, though, when a positive relationship is fostered with the child, they want to reciprocate that as well. And so when we feel fondly about the adult, we feel respected by them, we feel connected to them, we're going to be much more likely to do their work, show up to class, follow their instructions. So it's one of these things that 100% goes both ways. Also, you can have a child who's seeking control. And so that might be that life outside of school, maybe there's things going on at home, in the community, that are just seem out of control. And that can be like true chaos. That could be, loss of a family member, like just different things going on that aren't necessarily that somebody's doing anything to them, that somebody's making anything for, but just because of life circumstances, things feel out of control. And sometimes when things feel out of control in a big way, we want to grab some control. And so we will not listen to certain rules so that we are in control of something in the moment. We need to feel that level of control. Or inside the school, you see other people seem to be out of control, so you choose to take a leadership role there when perhaps the teacher doesn't want the child to take that leadership role. And when that occurs, once again, like they're trying to seek out control for some sense of safety, but it's probably not in the most constructive manner. And so the reason that I share all of this is that even if it is an issue of will, even if we are in a scenario where we're saying, okay, the child is choosing to act this way, they're consciously making this decision, there's still a purpose behind it. And so as we get to this kind of next part where we're talking about the collaborative piece here, as a parent advocating for your child, you really want to be figuring out, why are they doing the thing that they're doing? And sometimes we need to say, you know what, maybe the child feels like things are out of control and they're trying to grab some control back. Maybe you can give some insight to say, you know what, there's been a lot going on at home or with our family right now, and I think they're taking it out at school. And so being able to get that there's that control piece. And sometimes it's a tough conversation, be like, you know what, our child has said to us many times that they think their teacher hates them. And so if they feel that disrespect, once again, I don't think that it's true to the core, but if that's that child's experience, that would really help us to understand why they're behaving in a way that is likely going to cause that staff member to then feel equally hated or disrespected by that child. And it's reciprocating that. And so we as the adults, we need to change first. We need to be the barometer of those relationships to really move it in the direction that we want. But once again, I think that we default so often to that kids do well if they want to. And I think what we're finding is that the vast majority of the time, the reality is kids do well if they can. And so we really want to be sure, as the adults in the lives of young people, that we're doing everything that we possibly can to really get to the bottom of what's getting in the way. How are we able to help them to be more successful? And once again, just kind of at the core of so much of the work that we're doing, we want to be mindful that chronic stress and trauma can change that brain development. And so there's these exterior things that are going on that we've talked about in previous videos that can be playing an active role in causing a child to be lower in their brain. And when they're lower in their brain, they're going to be way more likely to exhibit some of these bigger behaviors of concern. And so we just want to be mindful of that. And as we move to this place of collaboration, as we begin to transition to this place of having constructive conversations and coming up with ideas for how to support our child, we want to make sure that we're keeping in mind that there might be some regulatory tools that we've talked about in previous videos that would be part of the solution based on where we believe they might be kind of operating from at the brain at that point in time. And then, so as we think about this, what we're realizing is to develop some of these skills, to really build them up, we need to look at it as a skill deficit. And so in school, we're very used to the reality that a child might struggle in, math and language and reading, and there are very succinct tools to provide support for developing those things. But what we sometimes lose sight on is that they can also be struggling with some of those thinking skills, the lack of skills with flexibility, problem solving, frustration tolerance. But oftentimes we treat those skills way differently than the academic skills. It's like you would never take a fourth grader, put them in an AP calculus class, and then when you find that they are not understanding the content, saying to them, well, you know what? If you can't figure out that problem correctly, you're going to lose recess. If you can't figure that out, you're going to have to show up for detention. We would never do a consequence like that for something that is so clearly a skill deficit for that child. But suddenly, when we expect them to have the problem-solving skills that they haven't been able to develop yet, then we think it's okay to use rewards and consequences, where once again, what we're realizing is that it's often more of a skill development issue rather than a compliance issue. And so needing to make sure that we're providing support that really aligns with that child's skill set at that moment. And step one for us as the adult is making sure that we're operating from this mindset that really says that we can't be taking these behaviors personally. Instead, we want to look at these behaviors and once again, act like a detective and really come to the conclusion that something else must be going on. And so as we realize that something else must be going on, we really then want to figure out, okay, what's getting in the way? How can we really help them right now? And so this is what kind of brings us to the core of this collaborative problem-solving approach. And so really, once again, we're focused on developing some of these thinking skills that might be a little bit harder to identify than some of these academic skills, but we're realizing, once again, that something else is going on. And so we want to be able to provide the assistance that they need to be able to do that well. And so then we're also just trying to identify what are these potential triggers that they might need help with so that we're able to give them the support that they need and that we're able to identify what's kind of going on in those really challenging moments. And then we're going to really partner with them to figure out, okay, what is the best solution possible? And so there's, we're going to talk about that kind of third piece here in a bit, what they call Plan B. But I first want to touch base on plans A and C. And so basically, kind of the idea behind this is that in almost every encounter that you have, and once again, we'll speak a little bit more specifically to a child's challenging behavior, is that there's three approaches you can take. Plan A is that only the expectation of the adult is considered. It's my way or the highway. So this is often the default that we take as adults when we're trying to support a child. We just say to them, you know what, you got to do what your teacher's telling you to do, or you got to do what I'm telling you to do. And there is no wiggle room. There's no middle ground. Like, this needs to get done. Go and do it. And I want to be clear, there's a time and a place for that, especially as it relates to safety. So during times that things might not be safe, where it's dangerous, it's just like, you know what, there's not a conversation here. It is just time for you to listen to me. And then there's plan C. And plan C is the complete opposite of plan A. And that's where only the will of the student is considered. And so this is more about, you know what, whatever the child says, we're just going to let them do it right now. And so this is typically a short-term or sporadic solution, meaning it's not going to be the day-to-day default, but we might do it for a period of time and we might do it at times. And sometimes this is called, picking your battles or planned ignoring of behaviors, things like that. And once again, there's a time and a place for this as well. There's a time to just say, you know what, if they're not hurting themselves, they're not hurting others, they're not taking away from other people's, opportunity to learn, they're not vandalizing anything, you know what, sometimes it's not worth the time or effort in that moment that it's going to take away from everybody else to try to deal with some smaller behaviors in that moment. So there's a time and a place to just say, okay, we're just going to let that go right now, and we're just going to keep moving forward. But then what we really want to be focusing on is plan B. And plan B is where we're making sure that we are getting kind of the will, the desire, the expectations of the adult, and the will, desire, and expectations of the child. And we're really combining those two pieces together to make sure that we're coming up with a solution that's going to be advantageous. And so there's kind of three key ingredients to having these plan B conversations. The first key here is, they call it empathy. It's the clarifying of the other's concern. And so step one with this is hearing out the child, hearing what is going on, what they, are experiencing at that time. And this is a time for us to close our mouths and listen. And so whether this is you and the school and your child sitting down together, whether this is kind of your follow-up after the school has reached out to you about a concern with your child, whether this is just you dealing with something at home with your child, step one here is to give them the time and space to talk. What is going on? Why are you exhibiting blank behavior? Why are you struggling during this time? Whatever the case might be, what is going on? And giving them time to share that out, and giving them time to share what their needs are in that moment, what their concerns are in that moment in time. And this is like kind of slow and uncomfortable the first few times you do it, especially if you haven't really been open to their voice before. And so this is really about giving that child voice. And so they might be a little bit uncomfortable or not used to sharing some of what their experience is, but we really want to give them the opportunity to do that. Then once they have said their piece and we've given them the time and the space to do that, that's when we get to share our concerns. And our concerns are usually around, we want you to be safe, we want you to learn, we don't want you to be disrupting others, we want you to be happy, whatever the case might be, but we get to then share our concerns and what we're hoping to be able to accomplish. And then once we've been able to communicate all of that, that's when the collaboration comes in. That's where we can then move towards brainstorming and coming up with a brand new solution for what we want to do. But what we do is with every idea that we brainstorm, we are able to kind of pass it through this filter of both our concerns and the students' concerns and determine, does this idea really meet both of those concerns? Does it or does it not? And so really beginning to kind of look at it in that light. And so you're able to come up with then ideas at the end that are a place that you can begin to move forward on your own. Now, here's the reality. This is not like a once and done, fixes everything immediately type of situation. You'll end up having more and more of these conversations. And once again, it's a little bit more uncomfortable at first, but then as you do it, it gets more and more comfortable, and you can actually begin to have these conversations a lot more quickly because you're already thinking, okay, what are my concerns here? What are some of the things that I want to talk through? And you're also getting used to probably getting better, both of you, at coming up with and predicting solutions to that problem that are going to be really helpful and advantageous as you're beginning to move forward. And so in the same way that kids want to do well, teachers and staff and adults, we all want to do well when we're trying to support a child. But at the core of being able to do this effectively is making sure that we're really kind of fostering that positive relationship. And so once again, when we're thinking about bridging the gap between school and home, sometimes it is us and the school having to have a conversation like that. Okay, what do I need to do? What do you need to do? What are your concerns right now? What are some of the things that will really help to create a better environment here? And then looping our child into that. And sometimes part of it is really just making sure that we are encouraging the school to have similar conversations with our children. And one of the things that often comes up then is, you know what, that's a really great premise, but how long does it take to actually have one of these, you know, collaborative problem solving conversations? And I think what you have to do when we're thinking about that is not only look at the time that you're spending, but the time that you're saving as well. Because really, when they've done research on behavioral disruptions and how much time that usually takes up during a week between you know, a child being asked to leave class, family conversations, school meetings, things like that that are going on. It usually takes up about 2.5 hours of instructional time each week, and which at the end of the school year usually is about 3 weeks of time. And when we're really thinking about a CPS conversation, that on average takes about 7.5 minutes. Now, once again, some of these early ones, you might find, oh my goodness, we sat down for 30 minutes to really try to hear everything out. And, you know, it was a lot of awkward silences. But then as we get more comfortable with it, you might have ones that take, well, 2 or 3 minutes. And especially for some smaller behaviors, it can be a lot more you know, constructive and simple to try to get to the bottom of it. But on average, they're going to take about 7.5 minutes. But also, we want to keep in mind that, you know, these behavioral disruptions are high emotional conversations that are not going to be good for the home and family relationship, for the relationship with the child, where these CPS conversations really foster that relationship more. They help people to feel safe and heard and cared for, and overall are really kind of building up a more positive culture. And so as we're really thinking about taking this collaborative problem solving approach and really the impact that that has on culture, it really just helps us to kind of get used to making sure that we're giving a child voice. And once again, even if we don't go through the like highly constructed version of that, the, you know, did I listen? Did I share? Did we collaborate together? Sometimes it's just as simple as, did we ask the child what they need? And that is such a simple question that you can ask if the school is ever reaching out to you saying that there's some type of issue. It's like, well, what did my child say they needed to be successful? And really holding them accountable to be answering that question is something that's really important. But also, you know, this is something that, once again, we talked about this already, but in your relationship with the school personnel that you're communicating with, this is an approach that you can take as well, where you're really making sure that you're taking the time to have a CPS conversation with, you know, school folks that you might be talking to. And the more we practice it, once again, the more comfortable it gets. But what I think is so valuable is that it's never too late to start this. This is great if day one you're able to be taking some of the ideas from this presentation and having, you know, the first kind of issue that comes up, having a more collaborative approach to it. But even if you've had years of really negative connection with the school, it's not too late to start. Because once again, if we can get back down to the core of, you know what, we're all just in this thing together, wanting the best thing for our child, then we can take a much more collaborative approach, and it can begin to move the relationship into a place that is far, far more positive. And just as a friendly reminder to you families that are watching this, I did a version of this video for the teachers as well. And so if you're, you know, if any of this kind of clicked with you, it's okay to talk to your school and be like, hey, by the way, I know that there's a video, you know, available for you all that talks about this approach. I think that that is something that you can absolutely do when advocating for this, to make sure that you are able to have a really productive conversation and then ultimately relationship with your child's school. So as always, I really appreciate the time that you've taken to watch this. If you have any questions about anything that we've talked about in previous videos or that we've talked about here, please do not hesitate to reach out via our website. You can email me, you can utilize our social media, but anything that we can do to be a help, we would absolutely love to. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.